Picture this question. Which company built the first touchscreen smartphone with a full web browser, touch controls, and its own app store, years before the iPhone? The answer is Nokia. In 1996, the company released the Nokia 9000 communicator, a device with a full keyboard, email, and a web browser that was decades ahead of its time. And in 2004, 3 full years before Steve Jobs' presentation, Nokia engineers were already demonstrating fully touch-based prototypes inside the company, with an interface remarkably similar to what would later make the iPhone iconic. That's the central paradox of this story. Nokia wasn't a blind company that slept through the future. It literally held that future in its own labs and still lost everything. In 2007, every second phone sold in the world was a Nokia. The company held 40% of the global mobile phone market, a market capitalization of over $100 billion, and a reputation as the most reliable device maker in history. For a small country like Finland, with just 5 million people, Nokia wasn't just a company. It generated nearly a quarter of the country's entire exports and was treated as a source of national pride, comparable to what Samsung is for South Korea. 6 years after its peak, Nokia's mobile business was sold for a sum that was fully written off as a loss within 2 years. The company's name became a mandatory case study in MBA programs at the world's top business schools, Harvard, INSEAD, Stanford, as an example of how fast an absolute market leader can lose everything. The most striking part of this story is the speed. Most large companies that decline need decades of slow fading. Kodak lost ground over years. General Motors went through crises gradually. Nokia fell from absolute dominance to virtual disappearance from the phone market in less than 5 years. This isn't a story about a bad company or incompetent people. On the contrary, Nokia hired some of the most talented engineers in the world, had a vision of the future, and even had the technology that could have built that future. This is a story about something far more dangerous for any business: how organizational structure, fear, and a single fatal strategic decision can destroy even the strongest company in an industry. Today we'll break this story down step by step, from a small Finnish pulp mill in 1865 to a global telecommunications empire that owned the world, to the moment everything collapsed in just a few short years. And at the end, we'll find out what Nokia actually is today and why the name didn't disappear completely. Stick around until the end. There's one fact about modern Nokia that will surprise even those who think the company is completely gone. Few people know that Nokia didn't start out as a technology company at all. In 1865, engineer Frederick Idestam founded a pulp and paper mill on the banks of the Nokianverta River in southern Finland. That's where the company's name comes from. For the next century, Nokia was a conglomerate that made paper, rubber boots, cables, and even gas masks. Only in the 1960s did an electronics division appear within the company, gradually moving into telecommunications equipment. In 1981, Nokia took part in launching the world's first fully automatic cellular network, NMT, Nordic Mobile Telephone, across the Nordic countries. This gave the company a unique edge. It was building both the networks and the devices for them at the same time, understanding the technology from both sides. In 1987, the Mobira Cityman appeared, one of the first truly portable mobile phones, weighing only 800 grams. This was the very device Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev was holding during a call from Helsinki to Moscow, a photo that traveled around the world and became unexpected advertising for the Finnish company. In the early 1990s, Nokia went through a serious financial crisis, partly due to the collapse of the Soviet Union, an important trading partner for Finland, and partly due to failed investments in unrelated areas like televisions and computers. The company was on the brink of bankruptcy. The new CEO, Jorma Ollila, who took over in 1992, made a radical decision to shed all non-core assets, paper, rubber, cables, televisions, and focus exclusively on telecommunications. That decision saved the company and laid the foundation for explosive growth over the following decade, but Ollila's bet paid off perfectly. Throughout the 1990s, the world was switching to the GSM standard, and Nokia found itself in an enviable position. A company that understood both network infrastructure and device manufacturing. In 1998, Nokia overtook Motorola to become the world's largest mobile phone maker, a position it held for the next 13 years. During this period, the company released phones that became cultural symbols of the era. The Nokia 3310, launched in 2000, sold over 126 million units and became legendary for its nearly indestructible build. Memes about the phone surviving a nuclear blast still exist today. Why Nokia dominated for so long? First, manufacturing excellence. Nokia built the most efficient supply chain in the industry, allowing it to produce phones cheaper and faster than competitors while maintaining high quality. Second, an understanding of local markets. Nokia adapted phones to different regions of the world, from extremely cheap, basic models for markets in Africa and South Asia to premium devices for Europe. No competitor had such a broad and flexible lineup. Third, a brand built on trust. The slogan "Connecting People" wasn't just marketing. Nokia phones genuinely became associated with reliability. Drops, water, impacts. Nokia devices survived situations where competitors broke. Fourth, innovation in design and features. Nokia popularized interchangeable cover panels, letting users redress their phone, built-in games, the legendary Snake, and was among the first to put cameras into phones. That it's worth understanding the scale of Nokia's global reach at the time. Unlike Motorola or its European rivals, Nokia built its strategy as global from the very start, not regional. By the mid-1990s, the company already had manufacturing plants and distribution networks on virtually every continent, from factories in Finland and Hungary to production in China, India, and Brazil. This let Nokia offer phones for literally any budget and any market, from models costing a few dozen dollars for rural regions of Africa and South Asia, where a Nokia phone was often someone's first electronic device ever, to premium business models for the European and American markets. No competitor of the time, not Motorola, not Siemens, not Ericsson, could match such a wide and flexible model range combined with such deep penetration into emerging markets. Thanks to this strategy, Nokia became more than a market leader. It effectively defined the term mobile phone for 1 billion people in countries that had never had developed telecom infrastructure before. In many languages around the world, from Swahili to Hindi, the word Nokia was, for a time, used as a generic term for a mobile phone, much like Xerox became synonymous with photocopying. Peak financial performance. In 2007, at its absolute peak, Nokia sold over 437 million phones in a single year. That's more than 13 phones every second, all year long. The company's revenue that year exceeded 51 billion euros, and the operating margin of the mobile division topped 20%, an exceptionally high figure for hardware manufacturing at the time, that BY 2000. Nokia was the most valuable company in Europe. It generated nearly 4% of Finland's GDP and almost a quarter of the country's total exports. This wasn't just a company. It was a source of national pride and effectively an economic pillar of the entire country. A cultural phenomenon no other company has matched. It's hard to overstate how deeply Nokia embedded itself into everyday life around the world. Nokia's standard ringtone, based on a classical guitar piece by Spanish composer Francisco Tárrega, became arguably the most recognizable melody in human history, heard by billions of people every day for more than a decade. The built-in game Snake, which first appeared on the Nokia 6110 in 1997, became the first video game played by more than 1 billion people, long before mobile gaming existed as an industry. For many users in developing countries, Snake on a Nokia was their very first experience with a digital game of any kind. The phenomenon of Nokia's indestructibility deserves special mention, something the company never planned as a marketing strategy, but which organically turned into one of the most powerful branding assets in tech history. Memes claiming the Nokia 3310 could survive being dropped from a height, hit with a hammer, or even theoretically withstand a nuclear blast spread organically for years and still appear online today, 2 decades after the model's release, that on January 9, 2007, Steve Jobs unveiled the first iPhone. It was a device with no physical keyboard, a large touchscreen, and a full web browser. At the time, a completely unconventional approach to a mobile phone. According to accounts from former Nokia engineers, shared later in numerous interviews and studies, including the well-known INSEAD Business School case study on Nokia's decline, the reaction inside the company was largely skeptical. Leadership viewed the iPhone as a niche product for enthusiasts, expensive, with short battery life, and unsuited to the mass market. Why that assessment was logical and fatal? Judging by the traditional metrics of the mobile industry at the time, battery life, build durability, price, the iPhone genuinely lost to Nokia's flagship phones. The company was evaluating a new product using the criteria of the old world, failing to notice that Apple was changing the very criteria by which consumers would choose a phone going forward. Nokia's internal problems. Beyond underestimating a competitor, structural problems were piling up inside Nokia. The Symbian operating system that powered Nokia's smartphones had been developed back in the 1990s and was growing increasingly complex and outdated. Building new apps for Symbian was significantly harder than for iOS or, later, Android, which discouraged developers. Nokia's corporate culture, according to former employees, suffered from excessive bureaucracy. Decisions about strategy or product changes had to pass through numerous layers of approval, slowing the company's response to market shifts. Researchers at Finnish universities, who later analyzed the company's internal documents, described an atmosphere of fear of speaking the truth. Middle managers avoided telling leadership the real state of new product development, fearing negative consequences for their careers that a year after the iPhone. In 2008, the first version of Android arrived from Google, a free, open-source operating system any manufacturer could use. This opened a second front of pressure on Nokia. Competitors like Samsung and HTC now had access to a ready-made, modern operating system, while Nokia kept pouring resources into the aging Symbian. The resource paradox. It's important to understand, Nokia's problem during this period wasn't a lack of engineering resources. The company had one of the largest research budgets in the industry. In 2008 alone, Nokia spent over 5.3 billion euros on research and development, more than the entire annual revenue of many of its competitors at the time. The problem was where those resources were directed. A large share of the budget went toward maintaining and slowly updating Symbian, instead of a decisive move to a fundamentally new operating system architecture, similar to what Apple and Google were building from scratch. In September 2010, Nokia's board of directors appointed a new CEO, Stephen Alop, a Canadian who had previously headed Microsoft's business division. It was the first time someone who wasn't Finnish and wasn't from the telecom industry had led the company. In February 2011, Alop sent employees an internal memo that later leaked to the press and became one of the most famous corporate documents in tech industry history. In it, he compared Nokia's situation to that of a man standing on a burning oil platform, where the only way to survive is to jump into freezing water, even though that, too, is deadly dangerous. In that same memo, Alop announced a strategic pivot. Nokia would abandon its own Symbian operating system and switch to Microsoft's Windows Phone as its primary smartphone platform. Why this decision turned out to be catastrophic? First, timing. Announcing a switch to a new platform that wasn't even ready for mass production instantly devalued Nokia's entire current Symbian lineup. This effect became known as the burning platform effect. Consumers and carriers stopped buying current Nokia phones once the company itself had declared them obsolete, while the new Windows Phone devices didn't arrive for another year. Second, the ecosystem. By 2011, app developers had already largely concentrated on iOS and Android. Windows Phone, despite its polished interface, couldn't offer users the same quantity and quality of apps. A vicious cycle where few users mean few developers, and few developers mean few users. Third, suspicions about Alop's motives. Because of his previous role at Microsoft, some shareholders and analysts openly accused him of effectively preparing Nokia for a Microsoft acquisition long before the official deal was announced, suspicions he publicly denied, but which undermined trust in his strategic decisions within the company itself. The result didn't take long to materialize. Nokia's smartphone market share collapsed from roughly 33% in 2010 to under 5% by the end of 2012. The company's market capitalization fell by more than 80%. In September 2013. Microsoft announced it was buying Nokia's mobile division for $7.2 billion. The deal closed in April 2014. On the surface, this looked like the logical conclusion of Alop's strategy, joining forces with Microsoft as one company. But the outcome turned out even worse than expected. Why the brand didn't survive even under Microsoft's wing. The merging of corporate cultures proved difficult. Nokia engineers, accustomed to a Finnish management style, struggled to adapt to Microsoft's American corporate structure. A significant share of key talent left the company within the first few years after the deal. Despite Microsoft's resources, Windows Phone never managed to capture meaningful market share. Competition from the entrenched Apple/Android duopoly proved too strong. In 2015, Microsoft's new CEO, Satya Nadella, announced a massive write-down of $7.6 billion, almost equal to the entire sum paid for Nokia. Thousands of employees, mostly former Nokia staff, were laid off. In 2016, Microsoft sold off what remained of the mobile business, including the rights to use the Nokia brand on phones, to the Finnish company HMD Global. Microsoft effectively acknowledged the Nokia acquisition as one of the biggest strategic mistakes in the company's history. The human cost of the crisis. Behind the numbers and charts, the human scale of this story often gets lost. At its 2007 peak, Nokia employed over 125,000 people worldwide, tens of thousands of them in Finland, where the company was the country's largest private employer. During the 2011 to 2016 crisis, the company and its successors cut tens of thousands of jobs. Within Finland alone, researchers estimate between 30,000 and 40,000 jobs tied to Nokia's mobile business and its suppliers were lost. The city of Espoo, where Nokia's headquarters is located, and surrounding regions of Finland experienced a genuine economic shock, comparable to what single industry towns face when their main employer shuts down. Finland's government even introduced special retraining and support programs for laid-off engineers to soften the social impact. For Finland itself, the collapse of Nokia's mobile business had serious economic consequences. Tens of thousands of jobs were lost, and an entire ecosystem of suppliers and partners that had worked around Nokia for decades found itself in crisis. That said, some of these laid-off engineers and managers later founded their own tech startups, partially fueling Finland's startup ecosystem, including in gaming, with the success of companies like Rovio, the creators of Angry Birds, and Supercell. The most important thing to understand is that Nokia, the company, never disappeared. What disappeared was Nokia the phone maker, as most people remember it. After selling its mobile business to Microsoft, the parent company Nokia Corporation fully pivoted to telecommunications infrastructure, building network equipment for carriers, base stations, and equipment for 4G and now 5G networks. In 2016, Nokia made a major acquisition, buying the French-American company Alcatel-Lucent for $15.6 billion, further strengthening its position in telecom equipment rather than consumer devices. Today, Nokia is one of the three largest suppliers of mobile network equipment in the world, alongside Sweden's Ericsson and China's Huawei, with competition from Huawei becoming a particularly politically sensitive topic amid Western government concerns over the security of Chinese equipment, which, ironically, has opened up additional opportunities for Nokia in US and European markets. What about the phone brand? The rights to the Nokia phone brand today belong to the Finnish company HMD Global, founded by former Nokia managers. It makes budget and mid-range Android smartphones under the licensed Nokia name, targeting mainly older users' nostalgia and emerging markets. This is an entirely different business in scale and influence compared to the Nokia that dominated the world in 2007, that it's worth considering a hypothetical scenario. Nokia genuinely had internal development underway on touch interfaces and its own modern operating system, codenamed MeGo, a joint project with Intel meant to answer iOS and Android. Only one smartphone on this platform, the Nokia N9, ever saw daylight in 2011, already after the fatal decision to switch to Windows Phone, and it received extraordinarily high praise from critics for its design and interface, well ahead of its time. Analysts and business case researchers have repeatedly asked, what if Nokia had bet on MeGo or on its own touch-focused version of Symbian instead of the Microsoft deal? There's no definitive answer. The company might still have lost given how late its start was relative to Apple and Google. But the speed at which the market turned against Nokia after the Windows Phone announcement leads many researchers to believe that this specific decision, not a lack of technology, was the deciding factor in the company's final collapse. And Nokia's story isn't one about bad products or a lack of technology. By the time the iPhone launched, the company's engineers were already developing their own touchscreen smartphone prototypes. The problem wasn't innovation, it was the speed of decision-making, a corporate culture afraid to acknowledge problems, and a fatal underestimation of how quickly the rules of the market would change. Nokia also illustrates an important nuance. The company didn't die in the classic sense. It transformed, shed its failing direction, and found a new niche where it remains a world leader to this day. A niche simply invisible to the average consumer who doesn't buy telecom equipment directly. That makes Nokia's story even more valuable from an educational standpoint. It shows that for large corporations, falling and dying aren't the same thing. The same lesson can be seen across other industries. Car manufacturers that once dominated thanks to gasoline engines now face a similar dilemma with electric vehicles. Media companies that built their business on print are facing the same choice in the shift to digital. The question isn't whether the technology will change. It's whether the organization can change faster than the market around it does. And here's the fact we promised at the start. Even though Nokia is mostly associated with phones of the past for most people, Nokia equipment is likely carrying your internet traffic right now. The company remains one of the world's top 3 suppliers of 5G base stations. And there's a strong chance the mobile network you're using is partly built on Nokia hardware. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the fall of one of the biggest tech giants in history, subscribe to the channel. In upcoming videos, we'll cover what happened to Kodak, BlackBerry, and other companies that once seemed unbeatable. Let us know in the comments which brand story we should cover next.